To understand Indigenous rights, the term Indigenous must be understood. Once used to refer to plants and animals in science, the term Indigenous is now internationally recognized and embraced by many peoples. A report to the UN by Cobo in 1987 provides the widely cited working definition of Indigenous. The working definition consists of 4 key components: self-identification as Indigenous, pre-colonial historical continuity, distinction from the other peoples in their land, and experiences of colonization and forms of marginalization. Definitions of Indigenous typically have varying degrees of these components, although it is argued that attempts at establishing universal definitions may ignore how Indigenous peoples identify themselves. As former chairperson of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, Erica Des noted, Indigenous peoples have suffered from definitions imposed on them by others. While there are many other definitions of Indigenous, the UN Working Manual for Indigenous Rights cites that the key criterion of self-identification as the expression of the rights to self-determination of Indigenous peoples is widely recognized today. There are several other terms that express the same idea as Indigenous: Aboriginals, tribal peoples, First Nations, pastoralists, etc. The rise of peoples identifying as Indigenous is connected to the post-World War II political agenda of decolonization, push for human rights, and an emergence of a new generation of Western-style educated Indigenous individuals. The United Nations, established in 1945, more than any other entity, pushed for decolonization, human rights, and established the norms of international law. While the UN goal of decolonization was mostly achieved by the 1970s, critics argued that the international law was not sufficiently taking into account non-state actors, specifically Native peoples who experience common themes of marginalization from state actors. These marginalized peoples identified under the marker of Indigenous to create international solidarity as part of the Fourth World. In response to human rights abuses on the domestic level, Indigenous peoples argued for these violations to be addressed on the international level. Indigenous peoples argued that they had the human right to maintain their way of life and distinct identities within states. The Indigenous rights movement began gathering steam in the 1960s and 1970s when several non-governmental organizations, NGOs, began to expose the discrimination and human rights abuses Indigenous peoples face. The NGOs found that Indigenous peoples around the world shared common experiences of marginalization in modern states, as the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples were disrupted by the state's economic and political interests. Indigenous peoples argued that by virtue of being Indigenous, they had the human right to maintain their livelihood. Perhaps the most important starting point for Indigenous rights was the establishment of the Working Group for Indigenous Populations in 1982 within the UN to deal with setting the standard for human rights of Indigenous peoples. In 1993, the organization drafted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which elaborated the rights of Indigenous people. 25 years later, on September 13, 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The Declaration established Indigenous rights within positive international law. It elaborated and set the basic standards, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and recognized that the human rights of Indigenous peoples were collective rights, which are indispensable for their existence, well-being, and integral development as peoples. The central idea to Indigenous rights is self-determination. As Article 3 of the Declaration states, Indigenous peoples have the rights to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. This mirrors the language of UN General Assembly Resolution 1514, which gives the right of self-determination to colonized peoples. However, the Declaration of Indigenous People clarifies that the right of self-determination for Indigenous peoples is internal as opposed to external, as the latter is given to colonized peoples in geographically distinct territories. Thus, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain their own economic, political, and social development within the confines of pre-existing states, but do not have the right of conducting any action that threatens the territorial integrity of the states where they reside, such as forming their own separate state through unilateral secession. The justification for Indigenous rights is a moral one to address the historic wrongs and systematic marginalization that Indigenous peoples face on their states. Despite the passing of the Declaration, the human rights of Indigenous peoples around the world are still being violated, as it is ultimately up to governments to implement basic Indigenous rights. Sidzus Masi for watching. Guahusipulan Esta.